Well, first off, I'm sorry that I'm not able to be there this evening. I'm not feeling too hot and thought it best that I stay away. So I hope this works out. Session 2, Connecting the Bookends of Scripture. So we began last week looking at those early characters, Adam, Noah, Nimrod, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all this led up to the birth of the Jewish nation. And why are we looking at the Jewish nation? Well, most of our Bibles, if you look at the amount of our Bibles, the vast majority has to do with the nation of Israel. So it's of some importance to us. Now we shift our focus a bit to Moses, who is kind of the next major figure on scene. So, sons of Jacob ended up in Egypt in captivity. The nation grew to a large size. Moses comes along, leads them out of captivity. Moses then becomes really a type of Christ. He leads his people out of captivity into freedom. Salvation, if you will. And of course, next scene there is Mount Sinai. Here we see Mount Sinai where a theocracy begins. Now, let me just read this, Exodus 19, 5 through 6. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. Okay. So what is starting here at Mount Sinai is a theocracy. And Moses is God's chosen key person to bring this on the scene. Now remember, God's theocratic kingdom, which started back in Genesis and with Adam, that was a theocratic kingdom over the whole earth. Adam was in charge of the earth, to begin with anyway. So this is a theocracy. It isn't a reinstitution of God's theocratic kingdom, because this is only part of the earth. This is only a bit of land, like the land that we saw was promised to Abraham and his descendants. So now Moses is going to lead them into the land under God's new rules, making it a theocracy. So there is thunder, there is lightning, there is clouds of smoke, there are loud voices. It's frightening there at the base of Mount Sinai. And the people have the fear of God in them. Moses goes up and he gets God's commands. He comes down the mountain, and in Exodus 19, verse 8, and all the people responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has commanded." So Moses brought the people's answer back to the Lord. People are like, yeah, whatever God says, we'll do it. Well, that didn't last very long, actually, as we probably know. Let's shift over to the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, we see some details of the law that God gave to Moses for the Jewish people. You know, Deuteronomy isn't the original name of this book. The Hebrew name was not Deuteronomy. That name was added or chosen when they created the Septuagint a few hundred years before Christ. But the Hebrew name for Deuteronomy was words of God. And the Hebrews would take the first few words of a book, and that would become the title of the book. And the book of Deuteronomy starts with that, the words of God. Down in verse 6, Deuteronomy 1 verse 6, we read, "The Lord our God spoke to us." God's words. So I found this a few months ago from a study in the book of Deuteronomy, where we see the 10 Commandments reduced to 10 words. And I think this is really cool. So, God says, "You shall have no other gods before me." First commandment. Reduce that to one word, and you have religion. God is saying, don't do religion. Religion is kind of when we create God in our own image. I've heard said that it's true that God created us in His image, but we shouldn't return the favor. So religion is when we say, well, this is what I think God will find acceptable. We come up with our own kind of methods. And God is saying in the first commandment, don't do religion. Second commandment, no carved image. Worship. Keep your worship clean. Honest, true. No carved image. Third commandment, don't take the name of the God in vain. Reduce that to one word. We're talking about reverence. Observe the Sabbath day. Reduce it to one word, time. God is just saying, give me some of your time. Every week, give me some of your time. Why? God wants fellowship with us. Honor your parents. One word, authority. Respect authority. You shall not murder. Respect life. You shall not commit adultery. Purity. You shall not steal. Property. You shall not bear false witness. Tongue. Watch what we say. And you shall not covet. The 10th commandment. Key word there, satisfaction. Be satisfied with what you have. Well, so God goes on to say, in Deuteronomy 12, he says, "Be careful to obey all my commands so that all will go well with you, you and your children after you, because you will be doing what is good and pleasing to the Lord your God." So this Mosaic covenant, we're calling it now the Mosaic covenant, starting with Moses at Mount Sinai, is a conditional covenant. We looked at the Abrahamic covenant a bit last time we met. Now this is a conditional covenant, unlike the unconditional covenant, which was true of the Abrahamic covenant. It is obey so that if you do this, then this will result. A few verses later, verse 32, we read, "So be careful to obey all the commands I give you. You must not add anything to them or subtract anything from them." Well, this turned out to be one commandment that they really broke in a huge way. When they get into captivity out there after Jerusalem falls, they start making rules of all kinds, and they felt that these rules, eventually they elevated these rules, their man-made rules, they elevated them to the same status as Scripture itself. So that when Christ came along, they were angry with Christ because he wasn't obeying their man-made rules. And repeatedly we see Jesus saying, trying to get them to focus on the heart of God's commands, not all these other things they'd added to God's commands. Eventually, they killed him because he didn't keep their commands. All right. The other thing we see is that God is humane. When we begin to unpack all these rules, which we don't have time to do, but God is humane. He knows that sin is going to occur. He knows people will divorce their wives, for example. So he puts in rules. So there are 613 rules. He puts in rules for this is how you do it humanely. You treat her with humanity, or with, in a godly way. What about if you go and capture a village, kill off the men, bring women back with you? God even gave rules for how you treat those women. And then, of course, we remember this is a conditional covenant. And he's giving them these additional rules so that, here's the purpose, so that all will go well with you. God wanted things to go well for the Jewish people. Well, Moses gets all the laws from God, comes down the mountain, gives them to the people, and all the people answered and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. So we think that it got off on a real good start, with very good intentions, which is often the case. Then we learn that in Psalm 147, he has revealed his words to Jacob, his decrees and regulations to Israel. He has not done this for any other nation. They do not know his regulations. Praise the Lord. Again, intending to keep them unique so that the people would say, wow, there's something different about these Jewish people. And just like earlier, when Adam and Eve gained the knowledge of good and evil, okay, you know the good and evil now. Choose good, don't choose evil. Here in Deuteronomy, he says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So, choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants. So, make good choices. Well, a little bit later, we see in the book of Samuel, people get together and they think, we'd like to have a king like those nations around us. They all have human kings. We just have a deity. We have the creator of the universe as the king, but we want to be like those other nations. So they come to Samuel and they say, now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. So the Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. You see, they had a pretty good king, but they were making another bad choice to get a king like the nations around them. So God says in verse 22, the Lord said to Samuel, listen to their voice and appoint them a king. And that's what took place. So we looked last time at a little bit of the Abrahamic covenant, which was an unconditional covenant. That's at the top of this graphic here. Now, as they choose a king, a human king, that kind of goes down a path of things not going very well for them as far as our human kings are concerned. And picture this now. We're in this Mosaic covenant. So we're in the Mosaic covenant, which is within, get my telestrator to work here. We're right here. That's nested within the Abrahamic covenant, and within that, they began to make a number of mistakes. One of them is choosing a human king. So what does God do in response to that? Well, God makes an unconditional covenant with them in the midst of this period we know as the Mosaic covenant. But this unconditional covenant, like the Abrahamic covenant, is an eternal covenant. So it will transcend, it will extend beyond the limits of the Mosaic covenant. So God says, well, you made a bad choice. You chose a human king. But in the future, I'm going to send you a good king, a righteous king, like the deity that was your king originally. That, of course, will be Jesus Christ. Prior to this, back in Deuteronomy, he begins talking about their bad conduct in the land will cause God to scatter them. And there we get this regathering covenant, I'm calling it. Because he promises over and over again, though I've scattered you, I will regather you. So we see God observing their misconduct within the Mosaic covenant, and in response to those types of misconduct, God is making assurances that in the future he will make things right. He will regather them for blessing. He will give them a good king. And later we'll get to the new covenant, which is part of this. Then we'll briefly look here at Joshua chapter 1. We know Moses didn't lead them into the promised land, but Joshua would. So then a whole generation of people later, as God is going to use Joshua to lead them into the land, God reiterates to Joshua this same land promise that he had made to Abraham and Abraham's descendants. So we read in verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, cross this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving them, to the sons of Israel. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given it to you. Past tense, I've given it to you, it's yours. Just as I spoke to Moses. But then, here we get not only east and west boundaries, but here we get north and south boundaries of this land. So from the wilderness, that would be down in Arabia, that's the southern boundary now, and Lebanon, the northern boundary, as far as the Great River, the River Euphrates, the eastern boundary, and the Great Sea, the Mediterranean. So we get boundaries defined again of this land. Well, okay, so we're having to skip a lot of things and fast forward again. So things don't go well in the land. There is a lot of idolatry, bad kings, a whole string of bad kings. We know all about that. People are beginning to end up in captivity in Babylon. And so there's a Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar. He takes a bunch of young Jewish people captive, including a guy named Daniel. And Daniel and Ezekiel are contemporaries, so they're both in captivity now, taken by the Babylonians. Ezekiel is out by the Kibar River in a little hut of some kind. Daniel is in the king's palace. Well, we read, however, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. You see, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and he couldn't figure it out. Finally, he gets to Daniel, who says, yeah, I can tell you about that. As for you, king, while on your bed, your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future, and he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. Okay, so we know the time frame here. Before long, Jerusalem would fall. And what was happening then in Jerusalem, the city that they thought would never fall, they had been attacked many times. They had always defended the city of Jerusalem. Well, that was going to change this time. Jerusalem was going to fall. Luke 21 says this, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, speaking of the Jewish people. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Well, what are these times of the Gentiles? Well, Ezekiel gets this message on January 8th, during the 12th year of our captivity. A survivor from Jerusalem came to me and said, the city has fallen. Jerusalem has fallen. This marked the beginning of what we now know as the times of the Gentiles. So the times of the Gentiles are those many years when Jerusalem itself was left without being under Jewish control. Maybe partial control during some, like right now, the Jews control part of the city, but they don't control everything up on that mountain, on the Temple Mount, for example. So either in part or completely, Jerusalem has been under control of Gentile powers ever since this moment in 586 BC when Jerusalem fell. And that includes today. We're still there today in these times of the Gentiles. Well, so Nebuchadnezzar, he has his dream. There's a lot of details in this dream, and Daniel fills him in on all those details, including the fact that Nebuchadnezzar's reign was going to be limited. He would be king of the world for a while, but then he would fall, and another kingdom would take over, and then that kingdom would fail, and then another kingdom would take over. We get into the Greeks, and eventually the Romans would take over. Talks about 4 kingdoms that would succeed each other. One kingdom taken over by another one. Then Daniel 2:44, he says, in the days of those kings, he's telling Nebuchadnezzar about these kings, but in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. Okay, so there's a 5th kingdom. We have these 4 Gentile kingdoms, all part of the times of the Gentiles, where we are today. But there's going to be a 5th kingdom that God himself will set up. All right, so we look again at our chart here. And here we have the times of the Gentiles. Notice that starts at 586 BC when Jerusalem fell. It continues through today. You see the church above that? We're part of this, the times of the Gentiles, when Jerusalem is still under partial control of Gentile powers today. But that will come to an end, and that's going to happen at the end of the tribulation. When the tribulation ends and Jesus Christ sets up his kingdom in Jerusalem, the times of the Gentiles will have come to an end. You see how all these things converge here? The second advent of Christ, the end of the tribulation, the end of the times of the Gentiles. It's a pretty pivotal time that is yet to come. So all along, these prophets are explaining to the Jewish people, this is what you've done wrong, this is why God is punishing you, this is why some Gentile power is taking over. And in the middle of doing all that, explaining their failures, they will always reassure the nation of Israel, but God in the future will restore. Let's go back to this chart. We've talked about God's plans to have this land and the Abraham covenant all given to Israel. God's plans to restore the people or regather them to the land someday in the future. God's plans to put a righteous king on David's throne in Jerusalem. And then we have the new covenant, which we haven't really looked at yet. We're going to dig into that a little bit. And the new covenant is about God literally giving the Jewish people a heart transplant. They have had hard hearts for centuries. In the future, God is going to give them heart transplants. He's going to restore their attitude toward Him. Now, as we consider all these prophecies, we would do well to consider how are we supposed to interpret all that. There's a lot of Old Testament prophecies that God has made regarding Israel. Do we take all those things literally? Or should we take a more spiritualized view of those things that God has said about their future? Well, God took them literally. In his own language, we see, for example, the regathering covenant, where God uses the word scattered and regathered in the same sentence. Okay, so we know God scattered them, and we take that literally because he literally did scatter them. Thus, in the same sentence, when he uses the word regather, we have to take that literally also. We can't change our hermeneutic in the middle of a sentence. Likewise, he uses some very literal language in speaking of this Davidic covenant. He uses places, like Jerusalem. That's a place on the map where David's kingdom would be set up. And then we get to the New Covenant, and it's equally amazing when we think about God doing heart transplants for the Jewish people. If you were to go to Ezekiel 11, we don't have the time to do that, but in Ezekiel 11, God uses Ezekiel to refer to 3 of these 4 covenants just in one paragraph. Ezekiel 11, you could look at verses 14 through 20. If you have time to do that, that would be good. All right. Here at the end of Matthew, we read, "And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from the one end of the sky to the other." So this gathering together of the Jewish people, it doesn't seem to be referring to where the Jewish people were at Jesus' days. And I don't think it's referring to where the Jewish people are today since 1948. Here it says, "He will send forth his angels with a great trumpet." Well, that would have been in the history books if that had already happened, but it hasn't. So that's something yet future. Let's take a closer look at this Davidic covenant. One passage that reveals this to us is in 1 Chronicles 17. "When your days are fulfilled that you must go to be with your fathers, I will set up one of your descendants after you, who will be of your sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build for me a house, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son, and I will not take my loving kindness away from him, as I took it from him who was before you, but I will settle him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever." Well, at first look, you could think maybe that's Solomon, but no, it certainly isn't Solomon. So I believe this is talking about this time yet future, when Christ himself becomes their king. And he moves into the house. "I will build a house for me, and a throne, and a kingdom." And you notice this is all using the same kind of unconditional language we've seen before. God just saying, "I will, I will, I will." It's not conditional. It's just, this is what I'm going to do. Psalm 89 says, "I made a covenant with my chosen. I've sworn to David, my servant. I will establish your seed forever and build up your throne to all generations." Okay, that's the Davidic covenant. 1,000 years later, an angel is speaking to Mary. And we read this. The angel is talking about the child she's going to have. The angel says, "He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end." Okay, by the way, where is David's throne? Anybody know? It's not in the heavens. 1 Kings 2, verse 11, we read, "The days that David reigned over Israel were 40 years. 7 years he reigned in Hebron, and 33 years he reigned in Jerusalem. And Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his kingdom was firmly established." That was in Jerusalem. David's throne is in Jerusalem. All right, so Christ is going to come back someday, sit on David's throne in Jerusalem. Peter is giving a great sermon in Acts chapter 2. He's basically saying the same thing. This is still going to happen. So now we've entered into the church age a little bit. We're just beginning in Acts 2 to uncover the church age. And Peter is saying, well, it's still going to happen. He's going to sworn with an oath, seat one of his descendants on his throne. So Peter is looking forward to this. And of course, he's speaking to a Jewish audience in Acts chapter 2. Later, Peter says, this was going to happen. "Sit at my right hand." Okay? So Christ left earth. He ascended. To sit at the Father's throne, at the Father's right hand in heaven. And he says, "Sit there until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." Oh, this gives us a clue when this is going to happen. There's going to be some war going on. "Until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." I don't think that's happened yet. Okay. So they're going to someday get God's choice for their king. Just think about the span of these three covenants here. So they start in Deuteronomy, the regathering covenant, promising to regather them after he scatters them. Well, that's about 1400 years BC. Then the Davidic covenant, that takes place about 1000 years BC. The new covenant with Jeremiah on the right-hand side there, well, that covenant was spoken through Jeremiah around 500 years BC. So we're spanning quite a large period of time here. When God sees they are misbehaving in some way, he establishes a covenant to reaffirm his restoration in the future, with the regathering covenant, with the Davidic covenant, and as we will see, with the new covenant. Over a period of over 1,000 years, God keeps reaffirming that. Well, this new covenant is exciting. Actually, it's an exciting covenant. Again, who is the covenant made with? In Jeremiah 31, we see this covenant is made with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. So behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So he's saying, not like the Mosaic covenant. My covenant which they broke, the Mosaic covenant they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. Okay. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, on their heart I will write it. I will be their God, they shall be my people. They will not teach again each man his neighbor, and each man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. They get heart transplants, and they get the Spirit implanted in them in such a way that they don't even need to do Bible studies anymore. Well, that hasn't happened yet either. Now you might ask, how do we fit into this whole thing? I mean, one of our goals is to look at how the church fits into this. Think about this. You're out hiking. You're going on a ridge line, and you're going toward the top of this ridge, top of a mountain, and you get up to a certain point, and then you look out and you realize, oh, there is another peak beyond that one that I'm hiking up. So I'm going to have to go down a valley and back up again before I get to where I really want to go. That's what's happening with the Jewish people. They see two ages, the current age, and they see the age to come. That's the next mountain peak. The prophets, the Jewish people, they didn't have any idea what that valley was in the middle. That valley in the middle is the church. That is the mystery church, which will be uncovered. Actually, next week we'll look at it. But that's how we're going to fit into this. A valley between these two mountain peaks, a mystery revealed. Well, this much we know. Starting way back with that scene in the Garden of Eden, they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden. There was communion between God and man. Then we look at Numbers 35, verse 34. We read, "You must not defile the land where you live, for I live there myself." It's God speaking. "I am the Lord who lives among the people of Israel." Don't defile the land. This is where I live too. John 14, verse 3, we see the same sentiment. "When everything is ready, I will come and get you, so that you will always be with me where I am." God desires our company. That's the way it's always been. Well, in view of that, it would be a terrible sin, wouldn't it, if we were to drive God away? God desires our company. We would not want to drive God away, would we? Well, that's exactly what took place in Ezekiel. Ezekiel is sitting in captivity when God grabs him by the hair. It's a bizarre kind of a scene. "He reached out what seemed to be a hand and took me by the hair. Then the Spirit lifted me up into the sky and transported me to Jerusalem in a vision from God. I was taken to the north gate of the inner courtyard of the temple, where there was a large idol that has made the Lord very jealous." So the scene here is shortly before Jerusalem falls. God has been dwelling in the temple all this time. Verse 4, "Suddenly the glory of the God of Israel was there, just as I had seen it before in the valley." All right. Verse 6, "Son of man," he said, "do you see what they are doing? Do you see the detestable sins the people of Israel are committing to drive me from my temple?" Right in the temple, there's all kinds of idolatry. It's disgusting. "They're doing this to drive me from my temple," God says. "But come, and you will see even more detestable sins than these." Then in chapter 10, "The glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim. When the cherubim departed, they lifted their wings and rose up from the earth in my sight, with the wheels beside them, and they stood still at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house." Okay, get the scene now. They've left the threshold in the holy place. Now they're taking the Shekinah glory of God, and it's transporting it over to the east gate of the compound, the whole temple compound. That's the next place we see the glory of God. Chapter 11 of Ezekiel, we read this. "Then the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels, and the glory of the God of Israel hovered over them. The glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood over the mountain which is east of the city." Well, we know what mountain that is. That's the Mount of Olives, the mountain east of the city. So the last place the glory of God was seen, and Ezekiel witnessed it here, but it was at the Mount of Olives. And then the glory of the God of Israel disappeared. So for over 500 years, God was not dwelling among his people like he always had. They drove him away. During that time, we have about 400 years of time when there are no prophets speaking at all. Malachi was the last prophet. Of course, John the Baptist was the next one to come 400 years later. 400 silent years. God wasn't speaking to people. The light went out in Israel for 400 years. But then in Matthew 2 we read this. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. Some Gentiles coming to worship Jesus. They've heard about him. How did they get there? They followed his light. It wasn't a star, because stars don't behave like this. It was a light in the sky. The light is coming back to Israel. Later in verse 9, after hearing the king, they went their way, and the star, which they had seen in the east, went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. All right, the light is returning to Israel. That's going to lead us into the New Testament, where we will pick it up next week.